thank for this opportunity to be here, both to listen and say something about love concerning the topics I'm working with. I'm going to talk about prenatal testing, which is one part of biotechnology, from one relational perspective. The topic of love opened an opportunity to look at the debate about prenatal testing with a topic of emotions taken into account. This will not be a sort of a closed argument. It is more an invitation for discussion concerning the pregnant woman's point of view from a feminist theoretical perspective. I would like to start with the love taken into account from a medical point of view. A Norwegian researcher on women's experiences associated with prenatal diagnosis, Siri Fuglen Berg, told me a story from a course she attended. Berg is herself the mother of a girl with trisomy 18. Her daughter died 3 days after birth. Throughout her pregnancy, after the prenatal diagnosis, and after their daughter's birth, she and her partner had to struggle for their daughter's right to life-sustaining help, and felt they had to fight for their own right to love her and wish for her birth and life, however short that life might turn out to be. Berg attended a course in pediatric bioethics, and one of the speakers argued in favor of cardiac surgery for babies with, for example, trisomy 18. Berg was surprised because this diagnosis, among others, has for a long time been seen as not compatible with life. This attitude is now changing in international medicine. But my main point here, though, is hers and mine difference in reaction to the comment this speaker made afterwards. When the speaker was confronted and asked why he would want to prolong and fight for the lives of babies with this kind of diagnosis, he answered, "You know, some people get something out of these kids." To me, this was sounded as cynical as something can ever be. From my point of view, he didn't acknowledge the child's worth or her life as a unique human being. He was just saying something like, okay, since they do have some value to someone, we should let that matter and try our best. When listening to Berg's reaction, though, my own way of reasoning needed to be somewhat reality-oriented. Because the attitude towards babies or fetuses with genetic conditions such as trisomy 18 is not necessarily that this child or expected child is something worth loving. Berg, as a mother and one who has experienced how you can be forced to fight for the right to love your child, no matter the genetic condition, but as your own irreplaceable child that you love unconditionally. For her, this was a relief and a string of hope. Her reaction was relief that someone actually acknowledged the love she had towards her child, the love that is unconditional and it does not take into account medical diagnosis or genetic definitions. The purpose of this paper is to look critically at the main argument for making prenatal testing for all pregnant women part of the public health program in Norway. The main argument for such an offer to all is that everyone has the right to make their own choices concerning their pregnancy. At least this right, to the extent the society sees fit, should be equally offered to everyone, not just the ones who has an increased risk of carrying a child with a genetic disease. The argument can be said to be based on a principle of individual autonomy, where the individual has the right to make its own choices based on neutral information in matters concerning the individual's own life. Many things can be said about such a principle in the case of pregnancy. One can object to this by saying that pregnancy can never concern one individual, and one only. One needs to take the fetus into account as well, at least at some point. Another objection is that this, in addition, concerns the people living with the conditions the prenatal testing searches to reveal, such as, for example, trisomy 21 or trisomy 18. And the search with selective abortion as the only treatment option makes them feel unwelcome in society. This too could open the opportunity to talk about love in the debate concerning prenatal testing in several ways. For example, the persons that live with these conditions are someone's children, someone's sister or brother, or someone's friend. Another way is to use the love we feel in close relations as an idea of how we should treat people that are more distant to us. If someone gets hurt, feel unwelcome, or discriminated by the society's legislation, the idea of love should make us reconsider our practice. These are both very important objections, yet they are not my main concern here. In this paper, I will ask whether a different assumption about the woman's own relation to the fetus will have to change, or at least nuance, the argumentation where the woman's right to make her own choices in her own life is the premise. What happens to the argument if we made the woman's love for her fetus or her future child the main assumption in the discussion? If we assume that initially the love is unconditional and it only becomes conditional because the society, the cultural and the structural settings limit this unconditionality. In other words, how can love matter in the debate about prenatal testing? I have some precautions. I know that this might seem like a counterproductive stance in some feminist contexts and discussions, though it is grounded in feminist theory. I know that I might not speak on behalf of all pregnant women. Pregnancy is a very personal experience, and the individual woman's attitude towards the fetus is not something I would want to moralize about. Yet, in a public debate that has been going on for quite some time, the patterns of argumentation sometimes can repeat themselves to the extent that they become self-evident. What I want to do is to try another path and see where it can lead us. I'm not saying it is the only solution, not even that it is a solution. What I am saying is that it is a different perspective, a perspective that could urge us to reconsider the self-evidence in the individual autonomy argument. At least it could nuance the argumentation in the public debate. I'll make some short notes about prenatal testing and prenatal diagnosis. Prenatal testing and prenatal diagnosis can take many forms. In Norway, up until about a decade ago, the main argument was prenatal testing should be offered to help women and families with an increased risk of having a child with a genetic disease. This would concern, amongst others, pregnant women over the age of 38 at the time of birth, women who had given birth to a child with a genetic diagnosis, or families with known hereditary genetic disease. Following the discussion on ultrasound combined with blood tests to assess the risk of certain conditions in the fetus, the discussion about giving such risk assessment as an offer to all pregnant women within the public health system became a public discussion. The pro-argument for such an arrangement was mainly, and somewhat simplified, that everyone should have the same right to make decisions concerning their pregnancy, not just the ones with an assumed increased risk. The con-argument, amongst others, was that this would lead us into a sorting society, where society sorted fetuses before birth depending on their genetic qualities. This is a very categorical picture of the debate. The debate was and is more nuanced than this. My purpose here is to draw certain lines for discussing the premise in the main pro-argument. To do that, it is important to say something about what such tests can say something about and how the results are presented. The last couple of years, the discussion about ultrasound combined with blood tests taken early in pregnancy have been combined with the discussion about NIPT, non-invasive prenatal testing. This technique makes it possible to assess the risk of certain genetic conditions in the fetus with the help of a single blood test taken from the mother or the pregnant woman. Both the ultrasound combined with blood tests and the NIPT needs to be combined with invasive tests to say something certain about the eventual diagnosis. Such invasive tests put the fetus at some risk, no matter its condition. Medical experts disagree with regards to the precision of the risk assessment tests and how big the risk of miscarriage because of the invasive test is. Yet it seems reasonable to assume that if every pregnant woman underwent the risk assessment test, and the ones with a certain increased risk underwent an invasive test to confirm the diagnosis, one would have to assume that some healthy fetuses would be miscarried in the search for the ones with certain genetic conditions. The risk number is presented as a probability or a fraction. For example, that there is a probability of 1 to 250 that a fetus has Down's syndrome. The use of ultrasound combined with blood tests would in Norway mean that with this result, the woman would be offered an invasive test to confirm or deny the test result. If the invasive test diagnosed the fetus with Down syndrome, she would be offered counseling and selective abortion. The counseling is expected to be non-directive. In the following, I will talk about pregnancy as a part of motherhood. Even though birth can be said to be a point of transition, where the child's life no longer in the same way is physically connected to the mother, I find it hard to think of pregnancy and motherhood as two separate forms of life and existence. I cannot say that I did not have any emotional connection to my child before he was born. He was my son before I saw him. He was the expected little brother. I had pictures of how life with him would be, and I felt fear towards everything that could happen to him, and I felt joy in connecting with him. Because I did actually connect with him before he was born. He was another being, different from me and different from his brother. In Moderskap og kjærlek, Motherhood and Love, Kristina Grenholm sees motherhood as a concept that begins with pregnancy. She describes pregnancy as a process of creation and as an existence that we need to accept, not to command. However, this is not to say that the pregnant woman is a passive container for something that just happens without her being any part of it. Grenholm marks that no one can contribute to another's development without herself taking part in it. Human beings develop in interaction, she says. In Grenholm's terminology, pregnancy is something more than reproduction. It is an integrated part of motherhood. It is, one might say, a relational project. If we say that pregnancy is motherhood, in some sense, and that it is a relational project, it also makes us vulnerable, because according to Grenholm, relations makes us vulnerable. It makes us in some sense dependent and heteronomous. Vulnerability is not something that is essentially connected to being a woman. Rather, vulnerability is essentially connected to being human. In moral philosophy, pregnancy challenges the question about the human subject in a unique way, because the pregnant woman and the child or fetus is hard to differ from one another. Motherhood is about being part of something you do not control. There is, according to Grenholm, no clear-cut line between the pregnant woman's autonomy and her relationality. At the same time, one might argue this about human existence in general. Even though pregnancy questions human subjectivity in a very particular and physical way, we are all relational beings, and with that in mind, we are in some way heteronomous beings. We live our lives within a certain context and are formed within certain limits of language, beliefs, and conditions for life. In some way, we are all dependent on one another. Within these frames, our concept of values and beliefs are created. If we assume that heteronomy is part of human existence, the vulnerability will follow as another human condition. As Grenholm points out, this is not the whole truth about us, but it is one aspect of life, and perhaps one that we pay too little attention. If we presuppose this vulnerability, we can take another step. If we assume that the best way to deal with this vulnerability is not control, but rather a recognition of it, we might find another path in dealing with it. According to Martha C. Nussbaum, emotions, and thereby amongst other emotions, love, might be understood, and I quote, as judgments in which people acknowledge the great importance for their own flourishing of things that they do not fully control, and acknowledge thereby their neediness before the world and its events. Perhaps this further explains in what way our existence is vulnerable. We do not control our surroundings. The world and the people we love exist apart from us and grows on their own. We are dependent in our own flourishing, but we do not control neither the dependents nor the ones we love. I think this is in line with Grenholm's thoughts about motherhood and human existence. We are not just autonomous beings, we are also heteronomous beings because of our relational existence. We have not chosen our children, Grenholm points out, though we have chosen to give birth. Who becomes our children is beyond our control. We do not know them. Nussbaum argues that some human emotions are universal, not necessarily in the way they are expressed, but in one form or another. Such emotions, according to Nussbaum, would be fear, anger, grief, and love. These universal emotions have their origin in vulnerability and connections human beings hardly can avoid, given our bodily nature and the world surrounding it. Nussbaum's project is to let emotions be an integrated part of ethics and moral philosophy. She wants us to think and argue in a way that is more in accordance with the way we live our lives and in accordance with the way with what human emotions essentially are. Nussbaum argues that emotions are an integrated part of human reasoning, not an opposition to it. According to Nussbaum, emotions are, and I quote, intelligent responses to the perception of value. In this way, Nussbaum puts the emotions in the reasoning itself as an integrated part of human rationality. She wants to get away from the dichotomy between emotion and rationality. According to Nussbaum, we need to consider emotions as an integrated part of a systematized ethical rationality. How do Nussbaum's and Grenholm's thoughts matter in the debate about prenatal risk assessment and diagnosis? I think it matters in several ways. First, it questions the way in which we assume human reasoning and decision-making takes place. When we say that results from tests taken concerning the condition of the fetus should be communicated in a neutral and clinical way as a probability in the form of a fraction, we assume that this is something the pregnant woman should consider with a calculating mind. Numbers are suitable for calculating, not for motherly love. Numbers and fractions promote the unemotional counting of pros and cons. In a situation where we have imagined a future life with a healthy, happy child, a clinical diagnosis that primarily explains in what ways the child you are carrying deviates from the child you have imagined. The cons probably will be the reasons that first comes to mind. If we assume that most pregnant women expect a healthy child, the information about different diagnoses probably in most cases will come as a shock and a disturbance to the way in which you imagined the future to be. In many cases, the information will be followed by grief. Yet, in the words of Cecilie Willoch, who has a son with Down syndrome, the grief isn't the truth about the future. The grief is a transition and a place for reconsideration and thoughts. Pictures in the heart and head taken down and expectations reversed. However, the child who shows its face makes the grief a creating process. When you see the child, new pictures of the future will appear. New pictures of the child, of your role as a parent, and of life in general. This is quite a different process than counting pros and cons. In a situation where grief may be the dominating state of mind, and where drawbacks often will be the dominating issue. In addition, concerning prenatal diagnosis, the decision has to be taken rather soon after the results have been presented. Because if you choose to terminate the pregnancy, it should be done as soon as possible. This does not leave much time to feel and think. It does not leave much time for emotional understanding. Rather, perhaps the loss of the child you imagined and expected becomes the dominating thought. The fear of the unknown, the stranger who has taken the place of the child you expected to come and whom you loved, and all the fears that follows an unknown condition or diagnosis. You are led to know that the child is not the one you thought it would be, the one you loved. To love this new child, who to you now is a total stranger, you need time. Additionally, given the relational nature of human existence, it can be argued that our thoughts, emotions, and perceptions are formed, at least partly, based on our cultural and structural context. When this context give the impression that some conditions are important to discover without giving any opportunity to treat the condition itself. This could say something about expected choices. The only kind of treatment offered is a termination of the pregnancy. Moreover, why would it be important to find out about a condition if not to treat it? You could do it to prepare yourself for having a child with a certain condition, or to prepare for a safer delivery of the baby and treatment of it soon after birth. However, several stories contradict this motive for offering prenatal testing and diagnosis, and amongst them are Berg's story, as mentioned earlier. According to Grenholm, heteronomy should not be something that we forgot or left out of the discussion. Rather, we should respect and protect this aspect of human existence. We need concepts like love and vulnerability in the public debate, Grenholm argues. She even says love is presence of vulnerability. This makes sense to me. Perhaps this is best illustrated by the experience of holding your newborn infant. A little creature who has been a part of you for several months and will keep being it for the rest of your life suddenly has a life of its own. A life you cannot control but want to protect from all harm. Yet you know that it is not in your power to do so. At the same time, you have an overwhelming responsibility to let the little child live its life on its own and protect it in every way you can, however paradoxical that may seem. The child's vulnerability becomes your own vulnerability, because the love you have for this creature makes your own flourishing depend on his flourishing. The love makes you vulnerable, but at the same time, the vulnerability enables love. I would now like to bring these thoughts about motherhood and human existence into the discussion concerning pregnancy, prenatal testing, and the premise of individual autonomy. I would like to illustrate the individual autonomy and mutual information in the case of pregnancy and risk assessment by giving an example. This is an imagined situation put together by different women's experiences on prenatal testing and some arguments put into a context of decision-making in pregnancy. Imagine you or your partner are 12 weeks pregnant. You are going for your scans as scheduled because that is what everyone does. You have not given it a lot of thought, apart from the fact that you are looking forward to seeing the fetus for the very first time. Your GP has informed you that this might show something wrong with the child. The chance of this happening to you, though, is minimal. You are relatively young. You have never before given birth to a child with a genetic condition like the ones they are testing for, and there are no known cases of genetic disease in yours or your partner's family. Thus, your attitude towards this checkup is the way it usually is towards a routine check. You look forward to confirming that everything seems normal and to listen to the sound of the little heart beating. This time, you will even get a glimpse of the creature that has made you feel tired, scared, and happy for some months now. You take the tests, see the picture on the screen, and know that something is going on in there. Someone is growing inside you, and within a few months, you will be able to hold that little boy or girl in your arms for the very first time. A doctor then presents you with some numbers. The risk of Down syndrome, taking your age and other statistical facts before the tests, was 1 in 1,000. After the tests, though, the risk of the fetus having Down syndrome is 1 in 200. Okay, you might say, This cannot be that bad. 1 in 200 is not that big of a risk. It is a risk of 0.5%. Yet the risk now, compared to the one before the test, is 5 times as big. Something must imply that not everything is the way it should be. You are offered invasive tests to deny or confirm Down syndrome. This test, though, involves risk of miscarriage, about the same risk as the risk of the baby having Down syndrome. What you want to do is entirely up to you. You now have the knowledge, and you can now make your own choice based on objective statistical facts. The problem is that to you, this is not statistics. It is your child. It is not 1 in a million cases. It is 1 in 1 case. In addition, what would the information mean to you? What if the baby actually will be diagnosed with Down syndrome? Would that mean a termination of the pregnancy? Yet, if you do not take the test, would that mean fear and grief the rest of the pregnancy? Would it mean that you would not be looking forward to meeting this child because you would not know what to expect? Can you live with that kind of uncertainty? Say you decide to take the invasive test, and that this test confirms the suspicion of Down syndrome, and that the test does not lead to miscarriage. You have yet another choice to make. Is a child with Down syndrome something you can manage? Is it something your partner can manage? Is it something your children can manage, your other children? Will you be able to take care of the child's siblings, or will all your time and energy be put into the care of this child? Fortunately, you have an appointment with a genetic counselor or a doctor who will tell you more about your situation. At your meeting with the counselor, you are informed of all the difficulties and grave medical conditions this diagnosis may imply. He or she also tells you that there are several degrees of disability and no way of finding out which is the case with your future child. Perhaps you are told that only the healthiest cases are presented through the media. It is still up to you to decide what to do, but you should decide rather soon. If you want to terminate the pregnancy, this should be done as soon as possible. You would have to meet a board to get your application for termination granted, but this would be mere routine and not something that you should be worried about. Anyway, it is your decision. Statistical facts and risk assessment can tell us many things and help us define challenges and possible solutions. The problem with statistics, though, is that it can be said to be based on the thought of the individual as one in many, not the individual as the only one that matters right here, right now. For the pregnant woman, the 1 million others are irrelevant. It is her child, her life, and her future dream. This is the only thing that matters to her. Grenholm, as referred earlier, says that pregnancy is something the pregnant woman cannot control, though she is taking an active part in it. Pregnancy is a relational project, and there is no clear-cut line between the pregnant woman's autonomy and her relationality. Grenholm also points out that we do not choose our children. As noted, who becomes our children is beyond our control, and we do not know them. Prenatal testing will not change this. Through prenatal testing, we can have some information about the children's genetic condition. Yet, This does not mean that we know everything there is to know about them. I can know if I will give birth to a boy or a girl. Yet I will not know if this boy or girl will be a child who meets the world with self-confidence that says, "This is my world, and I will get to know it in every way I can." Or if the child will meet the world with some anxiety and wonders towards all things. I cannot know if he will talk by the age of 2, or if he will still struggle to express himself at the age of 3. There is no way for me to know if my child will love to play soccer, or if he would rather sit down with his pencils and draw beautiful pictures of spaceships and flower beds. I will not even know if he will like to do any of these things. I will only know if I should buy dresses instead of blue trousers. If we remove the emotions, and perhaps most of all the opportunity for love, from reasoning and choice-making in pregnancy, we are left with a rather poor picture of human existence. Prenatal testing brings focus to certain deviations from a defined norm of the human condition and existence. This is the only thing it can say something about. It cannot say what this child will bring to you, to its siblings, and to the world. If we say that the diagnosis tells everything that is to say about an individual, we make that individual into the diagnosis and leave no room for individuality. We leave no room for the wonder and the mystery that another person is to us. We do not make space or opportunity for love. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, everybody. Some minutes to comments and questions, please.
Thank you for a wonderful paper. You're lucky to have such a doctoral student.
Yes, I am.
Many things to think about. And I think what you said is much more broadly applicable than only your topic of prenatal testing and pregnancy, the area of love and relationships generally. If I'm going to ask something in particular instead of just praising the paper, your quote about love making you vulnerable, but at the same time vulnerability enabling love, is that something you've thought of and discovered through your research, or is that a quote from someone? It's a wonderful quote, at least.
It is built on Grenholm, but a little bit. I couldn't put Grenholm beneath it.
It's not a direct quote.
No.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps some comment to our colleagues from other countries. Christina Gredholm was professor in ethics in Karlstad, Sweden, and she is now working with the Swedish bishops as their theological expert. And she writes for the church and for our religion. Please talk.
Thank you for a very stimulating paper. One thing I thought about is the mother's love and this relation. Is there a danger here to sort of idealize this relation of the mother's love, to see this very relation as some sort of ideal place for human love or interpersonal love, and then thinking of how complicated also this relation between mother and child is in all its the different person, different mothers, some, yes.
Absolutely. I think it's complicated in many ways, both in the idealization and then what if that love isn't there, to make this a norm. But that's also why I have all these precautions, because I don't mean that this is the only perspective that should count in discussing love or prenatal testing or biotechnology or how you should relate to your neighbor. But I think this is a perspective that we just throw out. We don't want to talk about this because it's so normative and frightening, and so I think we need this too, in addition to other perspectives.
Perhaps this can remind us that it is dangerous to identify love and the feeling of love. It's also very dangerous to identify mourning with the feeling of mourning. We can be in grief without the feeling of mourning, and we can be in love without the feeling of love. Love is a condition more than a feeling. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Of course, we can include all the branches in the room. But we can return to the questions in the fourth hour. Then we meet again, 11:10 for the dog's lesson. Okay.